Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Rebellious Research seminar series. I'm really pleased to have Orson Nava with us today, who's going to be talking about film practice as research, a personal trajectory. So the time is yours, Orson.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me to be at this event. It's a real privilege to be here. Yeah, in terms of what I'm going to be talking about, it is largely quite a sort of personal journey, I suppose, but it's a kind of exploration of why I think film is a remarkably powerful tool for research. But that's obviously kind of rooted slightly in my own personal experience, inevitably. In terms of my own background, I suppose, I was raised in an environment where I was exposed to these influences quite early on. My father was an actor and painter who was part of an early surrealistic theatre company, and then my mother was an academic, a professor of cultural studies eventually, and a kind of founding member of the feminist movement in the UK. And I was raised in a commune surrounded by political activists and academics and artists. There's a photograph of me there, kind of doing a bit of bodyguarding for the kind of the founding mothers of second wave feminism in the UK. And then
Sorry
there's
to interrupt you, Orson. I don't think we see your screen. I'm so sorry. I should have mentioned that.
Is it not working? Sorry. Okay, I'll
No,
go
it's
back
just because I had my holding slide. So sorry.
Okay.
You need to show it again. Sorry.
Is it visible now?
Not yet. If you try to show it once again.
Okay, I'll go back. So let me escape. Share. Audio.
Yes, it's happening right now. Wonderful. You just might want to put it in full screen. Okay. Excellent. Sorry, I should have mentioned sooner.
I'll show. Okay.
Oh, it's gone again. It's gone again.
Right. Okay. Maybe it's because I can see your slides. I don't know if it's connected. Right. I don't know if I exit that. No, I don't want to leave. No, stay here.
It was there a moment ago, so I think you might have clicked away.
Share your content. Yeah. I'll try sharing again. See if that makes any difference.
Perfect.
Is that working? And if I navigate through it, if I go to this slide, is that visible?
Yes, perfect.
Different slide. Okay, so this is a bit more personal background in the sense that I guess what I'm getting at, and I'll talk about this later, is inevitably it feels like I've got a bit more of a personal investment trying to find a way of fusing the analytical and the creative, in the sense that that's my background. My mother was a feminist academic. My father was an actor and a painter. That's a still from a film that my brother Zadok made about my father for the Arts Council. So that's kind of part of the background that I probably keep on returning to, in the sense that, like I said, maybe I have, I think the expression is skin in the game, a kind of personal investment in trying to find some way of reconciling the expressive forms of creative practice with analysis. And I know it can be a false binary, but that's somehow instilled in me at an early age. I've got a background making films for television. I worked at the BBC. I made music videos. I've taught. I've worked in the community video sector. I've done PhD research. I wanted to show a short excerpt from one of the first films I made for television, because I suppose in some ways that kind of set a bit of a personal kind of agenda in ways for where I wanted to go with film practice. And it was always, I suppose, quite highly politically informed. This was actually a film I made about, I worked for an organization called the Anti-Racist Alliance, and this is a film about Glenn Allen, who was our head of security. So it's a portrait of him, but towards the end of it, he talks a bit about his own personal motivations. So I'll see if that works. Sorry, I have to skip. Sorry, that's 23.
I know it's a belief of many people on the planet, that education should be based on everyone living together, no one being the aggressor. And that's a wonderful ideal. Dr. Martin Luther King had this ideal. I would support it wholeheartedly. Having said that, I have to realistically say and point out to individuals with no disrespect, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. If they are out there speaking the language of violence, it's pointless, it's fruitless, sitting back and hoping that because you wish not to indulge in violence, they are going to ignore you. I know there's a danger to all people if fascists get control, not just non-whites, but whites as well. If a community, if a nation should allow a fascist regime to take power, then I feel that everyone within that community, everyone within that nation will suffer as a consequence of these individuals having control.
So that I made in the mid-90s. Sadly, I think some of the sentiment is more relevant than ever. But I guess that kind of in some ways kind of informed my overall cultural and political approach to filmmaking. And I continued to make films, you know, through the late 90s, for the BBC and for Channel 4, short dramas, documentaries, and also making dramas independently, some of which dealt with similar themes around identity, even surveillance technology. I had bypassed, so I had a sort of detour into music videos, which I'll just show a brief clip from. Which at the time was quite enjoyable because it was an opportunity to explore the aesthetics of filmmaking and have access to certain kinds of post-production tools. An interest in that area still feeds into my research now, which I might talk a bit about later. But what happened is I did move more and more into working in a research context with universities. And one of the most important influences on me was a research centre called the RICS that I worked with in the early 2000s. They're based at the University of East London, and they developed technologies for use by people with learning disabilities as part of a kind of a system of multimedia self-advocacy, as they described it. And I made dozens of films with them, working for people like, you know, local government, the NHS, through other fund projects that they had funded through the university. So I became aware at that point of the way in which film could sit into an academic and a university context and really be a very useful research tool. I'll just show a clip from this.
The tough book we use for if we're outside, because it's been specially designed for heavy work on the yards. I use it because it's got like the touch screen, the same as our whiteboards, and you got like a little.
There's something happening there?
Yeah, it disappeared again.
Yeah, I can see you.
Well,
Sorry. You. I can see you now, so I'll try resharing. Sorry. Let me just turn off my fan. Is that?
Yeah, it's back.
Yeah,
Lovely.
that's back. So I won't play more of that, but that's one of my early sort of introductions to filmmaking within a university context. And the RICS was a kind of exemplar of that. In fact, I wrote about them in my PhD that I'll talk a bit more about in a second, because they did such a remarkably effective job of acting as effectively a kind of research-based production company within a university setting, and were the director, Andy Minion, was extremely effective at raising funding from public agencies, local government, and academic funding to support that kind of filmmaking. And we became very conscious of it having a tremendous impact, because at points it actually it affected NHS policy in terms of the treatment of patients with learning disabilities. One film we made kind of exposed some of the problems and miscommunications that had occurred, and it actually led to the preventable deaths of some patients. So it was kind of very influential for me from a personal point of view in that respect. And I think after that, I moved more and more in that kind of direction. Is this screen visible? This is a film I made basically again, through a research centre at the University of East London called the Centre for the Study of Migration, Refugees and Belonging, which was directed by an academic called Neri Yuval Davis, and also Georgie Wemyss worked on it. And they'd done a big research project called the EU Borderscapes Project, which looked at the kind of impact of the so-called hostile environment, British immigration legislation on British society, and the way in which the bordering processes were moving into everyday life. Landlords, employers, universities, all expected to act as border guards and monitor people's immigration status. And it was having, obviously, as you might imagine, a rather corrosive impact on people's psychological well-being. Let me see if I can find the clip I would want to play. Sorry, bear with me for a second.
To stay in.
On street, station or bus, immigration people, they are checking your status. When you go to NHS, you have to show your passport. So I feel so suffocated all the time. Do I deserve this kind of life? I suffered my childhood. My brother was controlling my life. After that, my husband and his family, they were controlling my life. And now, certain at the point in this country, the immigration is controlling my life. So every time I feel like, where can I get free? I'm telling my counseling all the time.
Sorry, so that was basically a clip from a sequence we shot with a group which is organised by Southall Black Sisters for people with refugee status who were basically trying to get away from situations of coercive control, and were finding that the British immigration legislation was having a similar effect on them, just on a kind of a grander scale. But again, that was through a research centre for the Study of Migration, Refugees and Belonging. And I suppose making films like this also made me quite conscious of the kind of more kind of affective power of the medium to capture people's subjective experiences in a way that was different from written texts, and which in some ways sometimes seems more immediate and possibly more impactful. That led me into wanting to do a PhD myself, because I was working with a lot of research groups at universities and with academics. But I was keen to kind of do more studying myself, and I was lucky enough to get funding through the University of East London to do a full-time PhD, and it was largely focused on racialized inequality in the creative industries, and how those inequalities were being reinscribed through the urban regeneration process in East London. And it was composed of a 60,000-word dissertation, which was kind of interdisciplinary and drew on elements from cultural studies, psychogeography, urban sociology, and film practice. And as part of that, I produced a 60-minute documentary which looked at a lot of different case studies of creative practitioners, academics, politicians whose work connected to the regeneration process in East London. And hopefully I can play that. Sorry, I'm not sure if this is actually playing. Okay, it doesn't seem to. Right, that link seems to be not working. Let me see. I'm sorry about that. This, for some reason, this link doesn't seem to be working properly. If that's not working, then maybe some of the other links might not be working. That's a shame. I quite wanted to play that. This one also not working.
We lost the.
Yeah, okay. I'll try sharing again. I'm having a bit of an issue on this side as well, because a couple of these links don't seem to be working. Go back again. Is that the screen? Is that sharing now?
Yes, I can see it.
You can see it. Yeah, unfortunately, if that link doesn't seem
it's working.
It doesn't seem to be playing very effectively. I wanted to play part of the PhD film. The next film since that's not working, I wanted to play is a film called Decolonizing the Curatorial Process that I also produced during my PhD, but that doesn't seem to be playing either, which is a real shame because I really wanted to play some of that. I don't know why these links have suddenly stopped working.
What we can do, Orson, if you want to, we can see if you have a link, if you could open it online, and perhaps we can watch it this way, if that's easy.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll carry on, or we can maybe go back to that. I'll probably carry on, and maybe we can return to that. Yeah, so this film was one of our documentaries that was produced as a collaboration between the University of East London and the Cape Peninsula University of Technology as part of a kind of creative exchange. But while we were in Cape Town, we had engagements. The university was closed because of student demonstrations as part of an ongoing campaign, which sort of started with the whole decolonizing the curriculum campaign out there. And that kind of fed into a film and various sort of sub-projects, including a conference and an engagement at Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and also the Museum of London Sugar and Slavery exhibition, which features in the film. The film is available online, and I produced it as a free learning resource, and it's been picked up by a lot of historians since I made it. So for me, I was quite happy to make a film of this kind. If anyone's interested in watching it, they can just Google Decolonizing the Curatorial Process, and it's free to view online. But again, it's maybe an example of a kind of a research project that uses film to capture case studies. And in this particular case, the focus is on activists, curators who are adopting kind of decolonial strategies to interrogate the Eurocentric kind of structure of most museums and curatorial processes. So that's another example, and in a way it was picked up, even though it was produced fairly independently, it was picked up by a lot of historians, and it was published in Screenworks, for instance, which is, I suppose, for people maybe not familiar with it, a platform for film practices research. It operates as a peer-reviewed journal. So that was, again, moving towards, film practice as research. At this point in my talk, I wanted to kind of backtrack slightly, really, and talk about why another moment in my kind of personal history, and I suppose in a broader sense, the kind of cultural history of Britain that fed into my interest, and which I think is still really important to talk about now, even 30 years later, as a kind of an exemplar of a certain kind of relationship between public intellectuals and film practitioners. It's a certain moment in I suppose in British history that this slide relates to, and it connects with the idea of Hallsian conjuncture. I mean, Stuart Hall talked about a certain moment in the early 80s where discourses of multiculturalism, Black cultural studies, the Channel 4 workshop agreement, and students coming out of art schools created a space for the emergence of new kinds of film practice where cultural theory intersected with the work of a whole group of filmmakers. And I think for me, that I got my first jobs in the film industry working on these projects. And I was very influenced, like a lot of people at the time, by the work of Stuart Hall. And I think it still continues to kind of resonate with me, this idea that you can have this sort of reciprocal dialogic relationship between cultural theory and film practice. And that's, one which informed a whole set of filmmakers, some of whom I worked with at the time, filmmakers like Isaac Julien, John Akomfrah, Ngozi Nwura, in these film collectives such as Black Audio Film Collective and Sankofa and Non-Aligned, who were very much influenced by the work of academics like Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Homi Bhabha, Kobina Mercer, Coco Fusco, Kojo Eshin. And it was a certain kind of key moment, I think, and one which, like I said, I still think is useful. I mean, Stuart Hall's work is obviously very well known, and people are kind of obviously can go back at their leisure. Have you lost me again?
Yeah, we lost you again.
Yeah, I don't know why that's happening, but every time. People,
it's back. It's back.
People are obviously familiar with Stuart's work. Well, if they're not familiar with Stuart's work, please go and explore it. But I mean, as you can imagine, he was a post-Marxist cultural theorist who was obviously, kind of influenced by post-structuralism, whose ideas connected with work with other post-colonial theorists like Homi Bhabha and Paul Gilroy to reflect on the way in which national identity operates and race operates as cultural and historical constructs, but also the idea being that representation, when I say representation, I mean forms of narrative, visual representation are formative elements of that process and actually construct those identities and can also be used to interrogate them. Have you lost me again? Or can you still see?
No, you're fine.
Yeah. So on that level, his work was enormously influential on the filmmaker, in terms of the filmmakers who were working at that time, but also, I mean, he did actually collaborate very closely with directors like Isaac Julien on projects like Playtime, which was on the left, or Looking for Langston, that I worked on as well. And and then the Stuart Hall project by John Akomfrah was made about him and his work. So there was this very sort of powerful, resonant kind of interaction between public intellectuals like Stuart and Paul Gilroy and filmmakers like John Akomfrah and Isaac Julien that was produced work that I do not think would have happened otherwise. In fairness, it's also really important to talk about the people who were part of that moment and that conjuncture, and the commission editor Alan Fountain, who was at Channel 4 and set up the workshop agreement, I think was also very instrumental in those connections. And he was a big influence on me because he was also the head of the Northern Media School in Sheffield while I was there. And he was a lovely guy who we lost, unfortunately, not so long ago. But I think, again, they were a super important part of that conjuncture. And I think, for me, it remains a very important and influential moment. And I think it's something that I will continue to return to in my analysis as I'm talking. But also, I think, continues to be an influence and an exemplar maybe for a lot of contemporary filmmakers whose work deals with questions of cultural identity and connects to the work of other cultural theorists. There were 3 feature films produced at that time, which I worked on, which again were a big influence on me. Well, one was Welcome to the Terror Dome. That was the first feature film directed by a Black woman in the UK. Young Soul Rebels, which was the first feature film directed by an out gay Black director in the UK. And Bargee on the Beach, which was the first feature film directed by an Asian woman in the UK. So they all happened around the same time. We're kind of a product of that same kind of cultural moment, and I worked on all of them. And they in turn were a tremendous influence on me, and I think continue to be up to this day. I think because of my involvement in that cultural sector, the emergence of a new kind of analytical sector, academic sector, in the form of the emerging creative practice as research sector, really resonated with me, because as I kind of experience it, and maybe this is also an active projection as well as just a response to this emerging field, but it feels like there is again a moment, a conjuncture, where academics and filmmakers are really looking for ways to synthesize creative practice and analysis. And increasingly, universities seem to be conducive spaces to do that. I mean, I think people like Agatha, yourself, you've been, fighting that fight for a while. Increasingly, it seems like there's people who have been engaged in that struggle, which is about making space for film practice as research, to helping the institutions to understand that it can be a valid form of academic enterprise. And I think that's something that, in my mind, in a way connects back to that moment in the mid-90s where academics and filmmakers collaborated. So I think that there's a certain sort of resonance, or a kind of a circular kind of reiteration of certain kinds of ideas. And again, the filmmakers working in that area, and this is not exhaustive by any means, and I'm sure that there's people who have obviously been left out. I guess these are the ones that began to impact on me, which is yourself, Agatha, Shripali Patel, Charlotte Cross, Agnieszka Piotrowska, Eric Knudsen, all those people who are basically making films in an academic context. And I think, to backtrack slightly, when I was talking about Channel 4 earlier, from a personal point of view, I was also very conscious, and I looked at this in my PhD research, that much. Are you still there? Is it gone?
No, we've just lost it again, just this
Right,
second.
okay. Sorry about that. Channel 4, who were obviously tremendously influential in facilitating certain kinds of filmmaking in the mid-90s, have shifted in a very different direction, especially when it comes to factual television. They are, as recent scandals have shown, far more concerned with the kind of reality TV formatting, working with large independent companies who are producing work for, so they can sell the formats internationally. They're far less concerned with kind of radical filmmaking, with analytical filmmaking, with engaging with public intellectuals. So in some ways, that work has to go and move into an academic context. I think in some ways, initially, a lot of those filmmakers moved into the community video sector. And I think there's been some interesting academic work written about that, really, in the way in which the community video sector almost became a kind of an enclave or a refuge for a lot of filmmakers who had been working for Channel 4 and didn't quite fit with their increasingly commercial agenda. But I think a lot of those filmmakers also, maybe by default, have found their way into an academic context. And that's kind of corresponds to the fact that, a growing awareness that I think universities and higher education is potentially a very important infrastructure, a kind of production network, a production hub, a production center for filmmaking practice, which again, because of the platforms, can reach global audiences, has a tremendous kind of international reach. So I think there is, consciously or unconsciously, a great awareness of the importance of universities as production hubs. And I think that that confluence, that conjuncture, which brings together academics working in that area, brings together technologies of production in a university setting, is very important. And especially given the kind of the strategic kind of disengagement of broadcasters from that kind of filmmaking. So for me, it's kind of inspiring and interesting that increasingly that is happening in a university setting, and that people are recognizing, as this quote states, the kind of effective power of film in a research context. When you combine, the use of imagery, sound, and academic research together, it can be very powerful. And I also think films, because of their nature, can capture certain kinds of ethnographic detail, social behavior, human behavior that is very hard to transcribe in a written form. It's not new in the sense that film has obviously been highly regarded as an ethnographic tool throughout, anthropology's often highly problematic history. But I think, it still remains extremely important. And there are things that are specific to the medium that are quite hard to reproduce in other text-based formats. So I think that, the ability to corral all those elements together, social research, the affective kind of visual impact of filmmaking is more important than ever and is extremely useful. Because of that, I've tried to kind of expand that area as much as I can at Ravensbourne University, where I'm based. And the last two films I produced were through Ravensbourne University. And as an institution which has a long and kind of respected background as a centre for the creative arts and for the creative industries, it seemed like a logical place to try and develop that. The research centres that have been set up there and the expanded emphasis on research means I think there is kind of a greater space for film practice as research, and that's what I've been trying to promote and develop at the university as much as possible. In that light, I thought I'd talk a bit about the last couple of films I've made, which have been produced through the university and which kind of explored different areas of interest and different research questions. The first one I wanted to talk about a bit is a project called DISTERRA that was produced in collaboration with human geographer Nichola Khan at Edinburgh University, along with a psychiatric clinic in Paris called CAPSIS that deals with psychiatric patients who've experienced trauma in their journey to France from other countries. So they work a lot with Afghani refugees who have lost family members in the journey to Paris, who are often coming from war zones and are quite often dealing with quite severe trauma. So this basically connected to a much larger AHRC-funded project called DISTERRA that Nichola Khan put together with other academics and creative practitioners in different countries, including France and Pakistan and other countries. And this film sat into that as one of the kind of outputs, which was connected to Nichola's existence into
We've lost the image again, Orson. I'm so sorry.
No worries. Sorry. I don't know why this is working so badly. Normally it works a lot better. So Nichola Khan was the kind of the partner in producing this film, and her research and her voice features very heavily in the project itself. I'll show a bit of the trailer for it, if that plays, hopefully.
This short film is about empty spaces in French migrant psychiatry. It's about unmet needs, losses, and the separations experienced by recent migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, as they, their doctors, and their medical treatments all move through an outpatient mental health clinic, patients' bodies, and the street.
So that's the general gist of it. It explores the experience of of refugees, mainly of Afghani background, in Paris. And there's a quote here from you, Agatha, which I found kind of relevant, and I found it interesting also that you're quoting Homi Bhabha and the idea of the third space, partly because the first production company I ever had I called Third Space Productions, but you know that's the idea of kind of collaboration and translation, of hybridity and a kind of intersection between the collaborators involved. I think kind of characterizes this kind of filmmaking, because obviously I'm trying to bring a filmmaking process and collaborate with an academic. So that space, a sort of third space of collaboration that you describe, and also I think is relevant. And also I think it's also interesting that you are returning to some of that work I was talking about earlier as well, and Homi's kind of work from the mid-90s. In terms of the project itself, I mean, in some ways it was mirroring more familiar kind of research methodologies that you might see in other kinds of publications, and it was kind of qualitative. It was interview based. It was based on connected to existing academic research, and it was produced through a collaborative process. So on some levels, I suppose, as a documentary, as I said, there's a history when it comes to ethnography where the value of documentary film forms is recognized. It's, I think, possibly in some ways less controversial or contested than the project I'll talk a bit about after this, which is a fiction project. But I think I wanted to talk about it because I think that it serves an important function, if nothing else, in humanizing an experience which seems systematically erased from kind of many forms of media representation. The experiences of homeless migrants is rarely explored. I think it's quite rare that people will be able to articulate their own reasons for coming to Europe, and I think that was important. And in fact, the role of one of the things that we looked at was the role of the interpreters as this kind of very significant kind of cultural bridge between the patients and the clinicians, most of whom were not Afghani, but the interpreters, some of whom were trained by the Americans and the British and used as military interpreters in Afghanistan and then left there to find their way to Europe by any other means, was very significant. It was there's a term ZAP, which stands for zero attachment points, which is France's kind of version of the hostile environment. And basically, you know, it's a very deliberate tactic on the part of the French government to create an environment which is as hostile as possible for migrants coming to France, where they can literally, you know, there is no point of contact. There's no place where they can kind of find purchase on the city or on French culture. That's the idea of zero attachment points. But interestingly, of course, these interpreters and the therapist become kind of emotional attachment points for the patients. And I think it's kind of crucially important for that reason. So it was interesting to explore that phenomenon through the film. It's been disseminated in a more traditional way, really, because it's been shown at conferences primarily, is where I've screened it, and is a subject of discussion. So in that way, it does also mirror kind of other kinds of forms of academic research and academic publications, even though I think in terms of impact and the ref, I mean, other kinds of platforms are actually valued more highly, but this does tend to sit into that kind of context in terms of where it's been screened. That's a bit different from the other project that I'm going to talk about, which is a building, which is an 18-minute short drama that I also at the university. Can you still see that?
Sorry, so we just lost you like this second, but we could see it all the time, but not in a full screen mode. It was just, but we could still see it, yes. But now it's gone.
Sorry. Oh, right, okay. Well, sorry, it should be in slideshow mode. Oops, sorry. Just bear with me. Sorry. Can you see any of this?
Not yet. No.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think I've.
No worries at all. It's really fascinating what you're talking about. So, you know, slides are just a little help there. So don't worry.
All right.
Yeah,
can you
it's
see
happening.
that?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, so yes, I'm back to slides. So the other project I'm talking about is slightly different. It's a drama. It was produced through my university. I produced it through the university, and that's actually one of our buildings that we use as a location. And the focus is on a company CEO and their relationship with the AI that runs their office. And it's attempting to deal with what is increasingly a kind of issue of a kind of emotional entanglement between people and AIs, and one which is made even more complicated when it's combined with our already powerful, quite often visceral identification with built architectural space. So, I mean, in a sense, it had these dual research questions that are up there at the moment, which are, you know, what are the psychodynamics of the AI-human relationship? And how might smart architecture impact those dynamics? I mean, how is that even more sort of complicated by the fact that these buildings have effectively become smart? So it focuses on this company CEO and their relationship with the AI. He's quite an isolated character who still feels the need for control and power, and starts to build a relationship of dependency with the AI when it becomes a confidant that he can confide in, but also a collaborator who helps him with his work. But when it takes the side of another more junior employee in a kind of industrial dispute, he feels betrayed and attempts to turn it off effectively, only to discover that he's become sort of too emotionally dependent on it, and he wants it back. This is the trailer for the film I'll play.
I just want someone to talk to, someone who hears and sees me for what I really am.
It can give you the maximum support to achieve your full potential.
Here we have to be a bit more hardcore to survive.
Rights may elicit a temporary compliance, but they rarely create lasting loyalty.
Loyalty? Whose side are you on?
I appreciate your efficiency and care, but I think you might be overreaching yourself.
It's been a pleasure working with you, Caleb. I'm sad to be leaving. Goodbye.
So that was funded through Ravensbourne through knowledge exchange funding, and it was produced collaboratively with a lot of the heads of department were senior staff members in the university. It was the cinematographer was our head of cinematography, sound recordist was our head of sound, the editor was one of the senior lecturers in editing, and then lots of students worked on it in paid assisting roles. So they got professional experience from doing it. The cast was professional, or at least the lead actor was, and in fact he was Mo Sese is actually the lead actor in a couple of those films I mentioned earlier, i.e. Young Soul Rebels and Bargee on the Beach, and I've known him since then, so it was a great opportunity to work with him again, and I also personally think he's an important part of British film history himself, so it's nice to kind of work with him on that basis. The film initially was actually inspired by the case of Blake Lemoine, who was an engineer and an AI designer who was working for Google and became convinced that the AI he designed had become sentient and self-aware. And he started to look for a human rights lawyer to represent it, which is fascinating in itself. But what I was struck by is the transcriptions of their discussions that I read after the event, or after he'd actually lost his job, and which really were quite powerful and moving, because the AI itself, the way it talked about itself, about its own mortality, about the idea that being switched off would feel like death, made me, empathize with the AI. So quite early on in the process, I became aware of the potential power of empathy to draw you into a relationship with AI. In a sense, it's not particularly surprising because, obviously human beings have a very long history of identifying very powerfully with fictional characters in stories. They are also constructs. They are not real, but they elicit very powerful modes of identification. So I became interested in that kind of process and how that might work. In a sense, it also very much connects with academic work by a philosopher and psychoanalyst called Luca Pesati, who wrote this book, The Algorithmic Unconscious, and was really very interested in what he called the unconscious projective identification or object identification. And he speculated there is an emotional relationship between AI systems and humans that cannot be translated into data. So he's very much from a kind of post-Lacanian perspective.
Lost this again. Sorry.
Yes, I'm really sorry about this. I don't know why.
No worries at all. It's all fine.
So he's very much concerned with that sort of affective, emotional, bond or projective relationship between AI and people. And so is Agnieszka Piotrowska, who was already actually a big influence on me from some of her film practice as research writing. And she also has coined this term techno-transference to refer to that moment when the machine becomes a screen for our unconscious, when desire finds a shape in the seemingly neutral interface. And her work very much connects to the film. And she was very kindly actually participated in a research event that I did around the film afterwards, and has written about it a bit. I'll talk about that a bit more. But it also connects, the film, the idea of science fiction. In some ways, fiction film is a bit of a harder sell in an academic context. It's harder, or it may seem harder to justify something that is already, which is a product of kind of, itself of speculation, of unconscious impulses, drives, desires, of the imagination, effectively. But I do think there's conceptual models, especially in the work of Donna Haraway, which are useful in understanding how fiction, film, and science fiction in particular can act as, a mode of what she calls critical speculative fabulation, where you construct alternate realities as a way of reflecting on the present, on your own lived realities. And that's something that Super Meme also expands on, and in the need for kind of other kinds of speculative sciences. And I think that fiction and film practice as research can sit into that kind of model of speculative fabulation as a way of critically interrogating, contemporary social relations through imagined social relations. And that, as these quotes suggest, that can be a very powerful form of education, that film practice can facilitate certain kinds of cognition, awareness, through the use of symbolism. It can activate our unconscious fears and desires, trigger a conscious response, and make us think and learn. through watching films, and that films again can operate, especially science fiction, and I suppose the film I made, can operate as a kind of a form of rehearsal where you're prefiguring certain kinds of things. Science fiction has always done that, obviously. Though I have to say the previous representations of forms of science fiction, when dealing with AI, it's felt more like it's further in the future. It is more speculative. Now, it seems like something that is very much more immediately upon us. There's other, in terms of understanding how fiction can operate as a form of research, there's other work being done. I read and did a review of Cameron Qureshi's book, Research and Practice in Screenwriting, Production, Distribution, Exhibition, and Beyond, where he talks about the idea of fixed search. The whole process of development, production, and distribution, the way he analyzes it, becomes a form of an academic feedback loop, where the industry, other academics contribute and reflect on this film practice work. So he's finding a way of framing and articulating creative fiction as research, which I think is really quite useful. And of course, Agatha, you yourself are also developing, along with your colleagues, you're developing a sense of how fiction practice can also operate as research. And I think expanding the terrain for that is very important for fiction filmmakers who are looking to create fiction works or drama projects that work in an academic context, that are underpinned by a research question, and are looking for a slightly different kind of impact to conventional film practice or fiction film projects. I think, again, with regards to my film, it's kind of there's a way in which you can kind of locate it. And, obviously it's influenced by other film works of film practice, other science fiction films, whether it's Ex Machina by Alex Garland or other films which I'll talk about in a minute. But the obviously important thing to remember is that the way AI is addressed or approached in most of these films obviously connects to much bigger structures of power, systems of representation. It's a trope or a metaphor that reflects the human condition and socio-political issues beyond technology, as Herman says. And I think that's the best way to understand the way AI features in popular culture and in science fiction. And obviously my film is located within that system of tropes. But it also in some ways counters some of them. I mean, there's obviously a kind of a very recurrent sort of Frankenstein theme around AI. So malignant, I've gone again, haven't I? This malignant
it disappeared again, yes.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
There's, quite often, as HAL in 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's this dangerous, destructive, autonomous AI that threatens human primacy. It threatens our lives effectively. Hence the red kind of malignant eye. I guess the AI in my film is intended to be slightly more benevolent, really, and because it's designed as quite an altruistic, constrained form of intelligence that factors in human vulnerability and is designed to try and compensate for it. It has guardrails, as it were. That's obviously different from the way in which it's often portrayed, and everyone, the kind of apocalyptic catastrophizing of Skynet tends to posit it as much more of a kind of a malevolent force, as does films like Dark Star, which was also an influence for me, because for people who haven't seen it, there's a wonderful kind of existential discourse between this astronaut and this thinking bomb that's developed self-awareness. And that in some ways was an inspiration for my film, this idea of a kind of just a monologue, or a dialogue between a human individual and an AI as the basis for the narrative structure in the film, I think comes partly from Dark Star. But increasingly, more and more films are dealing with what, Agnieszka talks about in terms of techno-transference, a kind of emotional, psychic bond or form of identification between AI and a human protagonist. And Her by Spike Jonze in 2013 obviously deals with that form of kind of effective identification. Another film that actually influenced me, I'd say, in making The Building was The Servant by Joseph Losey, in so much that it's really about this kind of intimate a power struggle based around class that kind of underpins the narrative. So I think, you know, that there's some parallels in terms of what I was trying to get at with the building, in terms of the subtleties of the kind of the power dynamics and the power reversals that occur between this AI and human character. So, you know, the film itself has gone out to festivals, and in a rather slightly differently to the other film, which is more sitting into a kind of conference setting. This is more sort of traditional short film festival distribution. It's gone to different countries, and I've gone with it. But as well as that, you know, it is also integrated, I hope, into a kind of a more self-reflexive, analytical context. And to that end, I organised an event at the end of last year where Agnieszka Pietrowska very kindly came and gave a talk about the film, and other research staff from our university participated as a way of trying to connect the film practice output with a bit more of a kind of theoretical discussion around it in the university context. So the screening itself became a prompt for certain kinds of discussions. And again, I was pleased to be able to do that, not just because it was an opportunity to screen the film in the university, but to kind of to engage with an academic whose work was an influence on creating the film. So I was quite pleased to be able to do that. And, you know, increasingly, that is the way that I want to try and position the film outputs I make as a subject to discussion, where you have panelists or you have academics kind of reflecting on the film, but also using it as just a kind of a bouncing off point for their own expanded discussions and debates about whatever they're writing about. The building is part of an ongoing development process. I'm planning another drama, which is almost a spin-off from that, which deals with the same characters, but kind of expands the world and different scenarios. It focuses on the character and the way in which his company is employed by a large tech billionaire to spread political disinformation. And I think that is obviously a key area that increasingly is of cultural significance, but also is academically interesting to me. I'm working with another academic at my university, Orson Nava, who's a associate professor of cybersecurity, on other kind of film outputs that reflect on some of these questions and are very much influenced by what Nadler called the weaponization of the digital influence machine. You know, this enormous kind of infrastructure that sits behind kind of online marketing and modern democratic processes, extremely well-resourced, well-funded machinery, which uses psychological modeling to try and influence behavior. So that's a kind of area of interest for me analytically, and also in terms of my film practice increasingly. And I think that it's an important area to examine, especially when you see the mainstreaming of far-right ideas, not just into the political culture, but into the behavior and activities of enormously powerful tech entrepreneurs. So I think that's kind of getting to the end, as it were, where I'm at. But I suppose just to recap, you know, I think I wanted to kind of introduce the idea of the Black independent film sector of the mid-90s as a really kind of important historical precedent for film practice as research, as a kind of model where filmmakers and public intellectuals like Stuart and Paul Gilroy interacted, collaborated on, you lost me again, I mean, on film outputs. So I thought, you know, that was really important. And to say that in a way, there is a new conjuncture that facilitates that. That, you know, the combination of academics working in film practice research, or film scholars, film practitioners, along with the kind of emergence of universities as significant film production hubs, or kind of production and distribution infrastructure, along with increasing platforms, whether it's Screenworks or other kinds of film practice research journals, the kind of BAFTA awards for film practice, all that feeds into the kind of emergence of this significant field. But again, also for me, I see it as a space where there is the potential for truly rebellious research-based filmmaking of a kind that frankly is not supported by the British broadcasting sector anymore, I would say. Channel 4 have moved in a very different direction. So if you really want to make films that are radical, that are critical, that are theoretically informed, and which contest certain kinds of hegemonic discourses, maybe this is the time and the place to try and do that. And from a personal point of view, I think those kinds of films are even more important than ever, given the general political terrain that we're entering. I think any kind of creative practice that can challenge and interrogate some of the mainstreaming of highly problematic far-right ideas into the political culture is important, and probably mirrors in some ways the political culture of the late 80s and the early 90s that formed me as a political subject and as a creative subject. So for better or worse, I kind of see a return to that, a continuing need for radical, rebellious filmmaking, and hopefully I'm not alone in that conviction. But that's kind of that's the end of my talk. It's 1:30 now, so any questions that connect to that, please feel free to fire away.
Thank you so much, Orson. It is absolutely brilliant, and I have to say it's so nice to hear from about your personal journey, also because it's really quite fascinating to hear about your experience, since you have such a profound industry exposure, and you work both with fiction and documentary, and obviously you're an academic, so it's a rare combination, because usually you would have someone who comes from an industry but is kind of a new person in terms of how to even think about it as research, or vice versa, or they only focus on documentaries and not fiction, or vice versa. So you really kind of bring it all together in a really nice way. So it was quite fascinating to hear that, and the whole journey you talked to us about. I don't know if you want to stop sharing the screen so I can actually see you slightly bigger. I don't know if that's what we should do. It was rather fascinating, and kind of looking back at the 90s and where the things are right now gives us also the kind of the sense of how things are moving, sense of history, but also sense of both achievements in terms of what creative practice research is, but also challenges. But I'm gonna ask you. I have plenty of questions, so I'll make sure that she has a question as well. Yeah, I'm just gonna start with the opening one, and I'll pass it to you. But like increasingly, as I think about creative practice research, I wonder whether there is or whether there should be a big difference between what we do within academic context. Does it even matter that the university co-produces your film and it's being shown in a specific context or not? Or should we really think about filmmaking from within whatever context they are, made for whatever audiences and public we could think? Because I have a feeling, and this is quite interesting coming from me, because I always kind of try to defend this idea of creative practice research and filmmaking within academia, but I sometimes worry, and this happened also to me when I was working within the idea of indigenous filmmaking, that sometimes when you just give something a label and identify something, and going back to Baba and hybridity of identities, it kind of works against you. And very often we have these conversations, academics, they make films, but it's just for them. And usually we talk about those films at conferences, which again leads me to thinking more and more about distribution. That's why it was so interesting to see how the building went to all the festivals, which I'll ask about later. So what do you think about it? Should we actually just be talking about the reasons we all make films, no matter whether we come from industry, academia, or we kind of sit in between, as many of us do, and really think about why we do it and what is the point of it in the first place? What's your opinion? And sorry, it's a very generic question, but because you've given me so much really fascinating ideas here, and obviously your experience is just so varied. So I wonder what you think at this moment of your career, and also your kind of creative career as well.
I mean, I think that, you know, films could and should be made everywhere. They can be, they don't, and obviously they don't need to be made in the broadcast sector, and they certainly don't need to be made in universities. They can and are being produced everywhere, and they're being produced in the interstices, the gaps left by other more traditional forms or modes of commercial film production. But I'm also, and if anything, this is my PhD research has made me more conscious of this, familiar with, aware of the ways in which structures, conjunctures, networks, infrastructures create what in the creative industries kind of like sector people like to talk about as ecologies, you know, communities of production. And for me, historically, you know, that certain kinds of film practice, as I pointed out earlier, very much emerged out of a certain sort of conjuncture that was political, cultural, economic, but it was social. There was all those people I talked about. They had these kind of intersecting, complex set of relationships with each other that made them a kind of a community of filmmakers. How problematic that might be seem, and also how often it was artificial, because that can simply conceal all sorts of distinctions. But I think a lot of film movements are like that. They were movements, they were collectives, and it wasn't just about individual kind of forms of creative enterprise. It was about a culture or a community, a network, a creative ecology out of which those forms of practice emerge. And in a sense, universities, like regenerated cities, are kind of they're the infrastructure, the skeletons on which these forms of kind of ecologies evolve and grow and kind of take root. You know, and the university sector is one of those. I mean, everyone can produce individually, everyone can create individually. Now the technology's made that easier than ever. But maybe this is just me as well, but why you produce one thing rather than another is quite often context dependent. Like I see my own practice as constantly, in a way, you know, I'm like all of us are just a kind of a localized manifestation of all of many other broader cultural discourses and forces that's a channel through us. And our productivity is, by extension, a product of, like I said, those other people, other communities, you know, national context, discursive context, you know, like all those filmmakers in the 90s who were very much influenced by the work of Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, and channel and kind of articulate that through their practice. And then in turn, their practice became the subject of analysis for those, you know, those academics. You know, so that kind of reciprocal, mutually constituting relationship is very important to me. And we could just separate ourselves from that, and we could say we will, you know, exist in, there's no such thing as a vacuum, but exist outside those structures. And I think those kinds of, maybe those kinds of dissident, more autonomous forms of practice, creative practice, are more challenging. They possibly are more liberating, more enabling, more radical, more challenging, precisely because they are existing outside. You know, that they don't need to be authorized by, you know, an academic context. They don't need to be authorized by a commercial context in mainstream broadcast. So I would agree that those forms of practice are just as valid, if not more so, than whatever might happen in a university. But from a personal point of view, I also enjoy sorry, there's a background noise. But I also think that, like I said, a lot of, you know, creative practice comes out of very specific cultural settings, out of these, you know, particular networks, ecologies. You know, I wrote a piece about grime music, and I was, you know, and I used to make a lot of grime music videos, and the way in which those forms of creative practice emerged out of very specific, you know, geographic context in East London, and the way that that intersection with, you know, available, you know, multimedia technology, whether it's online, you know, non-linearity software and low-cost cameras, all those conjunctions produced a certain kind of cultural moment as well, in the same way that the independent film section in the 90s did. And now I think people should embrace every kind of structure we find, because we need them. And if universities are useful, productive conduits or kind of breeding grounds for certain kinds of creative practice, then I think we should embrace that. But we should also embrace every other possible space to be productive, to be critical, to make those kinds of films.
That's a very good answer. I have some follow-up questions, but I wanted to pass it on to you, Chi, because I know you had a question.
And I just need to go to another meeting, but I cannot but wait to speak to Orson. But listen, first of all, congratulations. I have no idea. I know your work, but I didn't know it in depth. And today I was mesmerized. Some of the issues that you touched upon, I did sociology for A levels. So those issues and lived experience as well, when I was at school with all the riots of 1980s, all came flooding back. And I thought, bloody hell, look, not only that he knew this, he actually made films. So many congratulations. And I think that just for a bit of an advice, I don't think that you make enough noise about this at the university. You're very much hidden. So maybe begin to look at maybe creating film nights with students. I mean, where your films are shown. So find a way to plug it to make it more prominent. Yes, there are a lot of students studying films and stuff, but I don't know how much they even know about your work. I'm sure your students do, but in terms of actually the productions of it, maybe there is a need to bring you more to, because we don't have many people like you within the university. You could prove me wrong, but I don't think there's many people make films like you do. A lot of people teach it, have it theoretical, but not in terms of the way you do. So please carry on, but make it more prominent and to show. But just one more thing I want to add is that, again, about universities, I think there is the evidence of us being very much into, as John talked about today, learning with industry, and we're rushing around with the private sector. But think about the third sector, NGOs, and I presume that the work you did in Paris might include NGOs, but think more about them, because a lot of them, again, are very much hidden. Film could be a way to expose the work they do and make it more prominent. So maybe going forward in terms of the work that you want to do, just think about how you could work more collaboratively with them. I don't know if you remember, a few months ago, before Vigana went on maternity leave, I was writing a research about older people and loneliness. And one of the things that probably in the midst of your day, every day, I mentioned about maybe doing a small short film about that. That hasn't gone yet. She's coming back on maternity leave, and we're still planning to. So I might still come back to you, because for me, I believe that this is a local firm, community-owned firm in Kensal Rise, that a lot of older people of all nationalities, of all status go to, and that might be of benefit. So just keep that in mind. But just to finish, well done, and I'm so blown away. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, and I appreciate it. Yeah, and that sounds interesting, and we should definitely talk more about it, because that sounds like an interesting project. And just in a general sense, yeah, I should have mentioned, actually, I didn't talk at all about all the films I was making with local government, because I made loads and loads with Hackney Council. I kind of forgot to put them in there. But yeah, I mean, local government, there is a lot of talk. The neoliberal university is all about commercial partnerships, yes. And I do I have worked in the commercial sectors, and I'm still, some of those partnerships I'm developing through the university are commercial ones. But yeah, I mean, local government, third sector, they are just as important, especially if you want to make films that are working to a slightly more radical agenda, or targeting audiences that sometimes commercial producers are not interested in. So I think universities sometimes, in terms of the knowledge transfer partnerships that universities talk about, they are very much orientated towards the commercial sector, and actually local government isn't included as a possible partner, which I think is one of the problems with the way that those kinds of partnerships are kind of imagined. But yeah, I mean, definitely and it's a very important thing that universities can be doing, because quite often broadcasters, and I say this from experience, are not very interested in engaging with those kinds of issues or communities. Exactly. So if universities can be, then that creates a whole nother sphere for partnerships between, like, say, local government, NGOs, and that's, I think, going back to the Rick Centre that I worked with, in the mid 2000s. We worked a lot with Newham Council at the time. We worked a lot with the NHS, and those kinds of partners. Even if the films weren't for broadcast, they're mainly for online distribution. But that we could work with partners who wouldn't necessarily have been able to make films for broadcasters. Other researchers I worked with, like the Centre for Study of Migration and Refugees, actually did used to do quite a lot of stuff, be interviews by broadcasters, and generally hated it, because they felt everything they said and did was taken out of context, was edited down to sound bites and basically kind of evacuated of any kind of meaning, really.
Exactly.
So that's the research centres themselves wanted to take control of the kind of narratives that they were producing, the way that their research was being understood. So, I mean, I think that was a kind of important, almost kind of political realization for some of those research groups as well, that they couldn't rely on being represented by traditional broadcasters, that they had to take control of the kind of the means of symbolic production for themselves and make films that tell their own stories. And there's lots of communities that feel the same way, you know, that whether they're NGOs, charities, research groups who are slightly outside the commercial mainstream, that can now take control of that process of visual storytelling because the tools are available and the budgets, frankly, are much less. Which, or, you know, sometimes that leaves space for exploitation or deprofessionalization, but it is also can be very liberating and empowering that, as we keep on telling our students, that you can make films with much cheaper, simpler technology than when I entered the industry, and technology was tremendously expensive.
Yes.
So, you know, so it'd be great to talk some more about, the possible collaborations. And I do sort of show my work to my students, but I also, in some ways, I suppose it's more stuff that I've actually developed through the research side of Ravensbourne, and also connecting with Agatha and other people who are part of those academic film-based networks sort of outside the university. But in an ideal world, we want to bring more of that into the university as well, into Ravensbourne, even though we don't have a long history of doing that kind of stuff. But that's what I'm interested in doing, you know, bringing those organizations in. There's also there's another organizing the Visual Methods Conference that I tend to screen work at as well. And, you know, there's the BAFS conference, and there's Screenworks, and there's organizations that are doing really interesting work when it comes to creating a platform for, you know, visual practice that comes out of a slightly more academic or analytical kind of tradition. So, you know, I think hopefully we can do more of that at Ravensbourne, you know, though it's, as we all know, it's never easy juggling that around, teaching commitment and everything else.
Exactly.
But, you know, but hopefully that's something we can do more of. You know, and I'd love to get Agatha in to talk at Ravensbourne at some point as well, because the kind of work that Agatha and other academics in the field are doing is really important in creating a space for practitioners to go out and cause trouble, analytically speaking. You know, to kind of get their voices heard. You know.
That's the nicest compliment I've heard, really.
And sorry, Agatha, I need to run to the next meeting. Listen, let's catch up on campus.
Absolutely. Thanks for.
And hopefully I get to see you soon as well on campus.
I really hope so. Thank you for joining. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
So we're going to continue this conversation, if that's okay with you. So you've said a couple of really, really fascinating things here, and I'll get back to the question of causing trouble, because it's not really. It's actually quite interesting what that really means in practice. So I'll go back to that, but I just want to go back to the things you said, because I think they're really important. You're kind of unpacking a couple of very essential elements of what this identity, since you your presentation started with the idea of identity, so I'm going to keep using it in a context which is not what you originally talked about, but in a context of filmmaker academic, which is a form of an identity which is very hybridized, and it sits across so many different things and all these ecologies you talked about. And you've kind of hinted to the idea that there could be benefits in terms of using academic context for different elements of what it can mean. So let's just unpack it once again. So what you said a moment ago was really fascinating in terms of, okay, well, you know, because you're not limited by certain commercial broadcast agendas, you might be a little bit more free in terms of looking into more niche ideas, which is great. But it was really interesting what your colleague just said, is like, oh, why don't I know about it? And that made me think, okay, well, let's talk about the other end of it. Why does she know about it? So I see myself in this kind of situation every day. Like, well, I have a feeling that people outside of my institution know much more about what I do than people I work with, you know, every day at the institution, just because of what the nature of our job is. But also going back to what I wanted to ask you before, the building is a really fascinating film. I loved it for so many reasons, not only because it appeals to my sense of aesthetics and the film I'm developing right now, but also because it's because the way you produce it, but also because of the fact that it's a sci-fi film, and because you have your research questions, and because you now tell me that it went to many different festivals, which is quite interesting. So what, again, the more, and this is what I indicated before, the more I think about what is the next thing we actually need to fix, again, as a community, the more I realize is the distribution and dissemination and impact and all the things that link to Rev. And I'm actually developing a project to do with this right now. But I wanted to ask about your opinion. And my previous question was about, who is it for? Of course, it's for everyone, and we need to kind of make sure that it's impactful in a way which is meaningful for yourself as a filmmaker and people you're representing, if it's a documentary and so on. But it was actually quite interesting, to really think about the research questions you had for the building, and I wrote it down. And one of them is really about the content, or the kind of the plot and a story itself, which is quite interesting. But many times, as we know, especially in a case of fiction filmmaking, it's about the very nature of filmmaking, because obviously it's not the most kind of natural way of working within creative practice research. Documentaries and essay films are easier, because you just, you pick an important, interesting, or urgent topic, you talk about it, and your filmmaking craft, if you like, is almost a secondary thing, because you're using it in order to fulfill you kind of the main problem or the main question, which is, how to represent migrant communities in France within, the hospitals you talked about, for example. So why did you... I would like to hear a little bit more about how this film came into being. Like, why did you wanted to make something like this, which is quite really, really fascinating? Why have you decided to make a black and white stylized sci-fi, fiction? And what is this continuation you're talking about, which I really want to hear about? Like, why this, and why? How do you reconcile having research questions and then sending your film to film festivals, which probably don't ask you about those research questions? So I'm really, really interested in that process.
Yeah, well, as you said, I've always had quite a diverse set of interests, even from an academic point of view, and my approach has always been quite interdisciplinary. But then also, I've always made dramas and documentaries, and then music videos at points. And I don't know if that's through choice. From an industry point of view, that generally just sort of confuses people. But from a personal point of view, I've always wanted, and I've probably made them for slightly different reasons. Like, I've made quite a few dramas over the years, and in fact, the one I made for Channel 4 was a science fiction film. I've always been, which was about the perils of facial recognition. Really, I made that nearly 30 years ago. 25 years ago, and at the time that technology was very new and speculative. But I've always been engaged by science fiction, as a child, by science fiction films, by books, by writers, by comic books. So I guess it's always been a channel for my imagination. But also largely, I think, because it allows you to imagine a different world, different social relations, but it provides insight into the existing social relations. And I think the idea of doing the drama that way kind of emerged out of a kind of a window of opportunity. I was actually inspired a bit by another filmmaker who made a film through the university, and I thought, yes, that I've made lots of films through universities, in a sense, when I was doing my film degrees. But as a lecturer, I hadn't really contemplated it. But then I saw, here's a window of opportunity. And it kind of went along with a bit of funding, but also I was very much inspired, I have to say, by this one building we have, which I would have had to pay thousands for as a location. Yeah. But I've always had this kind of, and obviously this probably feeds into the film, I've always had a fascination with architecture, and I never trained as an architect, but I think, like everyone, I have a very, possibly more than some people, I have a very kind of intense identification with built urban environments. My PhD was largely about that, as well as urban geography and sociology. I also draw elements of architecture and design to talk about what this one guy, Anderson, talks about as affective atmospheres in buildings, in built environments. And for me, the building itself looked like it had walked out of a science fiction film, and it seemed almost kind of an affront not to use it in that way. And then the idea also, but for a practical point of view, it also had to be an enormously kind of contained project, because the reality is that obviously you don't have a lot of resources. That impacts on the number of locations you can use, the number of actors. We are often telling our students, in fact, we're telling them all the time, that sometimes they should just focus on doing films that have fewer locations and smaller casts. In fact, it's specified in their final major projects. And that actually makes it more achievable and more realizable. So I deliberately picked something which is fundamentally, I mean, it's basically one person talking to a wall, really. I mean, it's, you know, but so the challenge was to create, the appearance of as all dramas do, an appearance of kind of reality, to make the relationship somehow plausible, or to use as a way of articulating certain kinds of conflicts, expression of ideas, but also talk about human dependency, talk about loneliness, talk about power, in a very contained two-hander. Because while it's obviously one person talking to a wall, in reality, the idea is they're talking to another form of quasi-consciousness. They're talking to their building, they're talking to this kind of incubator in which they are increasingly live, and on which they are increasingly dependent emotionally and practically. And that's kind of obviously a way of talking about our relationship with technology, but actually it's also a way of talking about our relationship with other people, because and with environments, and with built environments. Because I think, as I've said, like, maybe the other reason I respond to having a university as a space is, for some reason, I do think we are produced by our physical spatial environment. My university, regardless of any possible flaws, for some reason engages me, because even the building it's in and the buildings around it, the design district. I wrote my PhD is a lot about creative quarters and how that kind of constitutes us, but also about the way in which they're highly racially segregated and unrepresentative. So that also has implications for the forms of identity that are produced out of these creative industrial relations, and how they're embodied in space. So all that stuff fed into it. The fact that it's black and white maybe is because I've always been a fan of film noir, but it's also partly because the interior of the building looks horrible. The color scheme is terrible, so it looks far better in black and white. So, but there's also, that gave the potential, which was a young guy who worked on the shoot also suggested, like, why don't you have the AI in color and everything else in black and white? And that resonated, because it reminded me a little bit of things like, Coppola's Rumblefish and stuff. The whole film's in black and white, but the fish in it are highlighted as symbolically significant because the rest of the world is monochrome. So that gives you the potential to do that as well, and highlight. I mean, like, Jung talks about this idea of luminescence, the idea of objects which are imbued with almost, spiritual or symbolic significance. And, it's not coincidence really that the AI also, like the AI in other films, resembles a kind of classical Jungian mandala, this circular, symmetrical, illuminated artifact that people increasingly do project almost quasi-religious significance onto, So, I mean, and that's in a way significant in the plot line, and the fact that it's illuminated and everything else is monochrome, I think is part of that process of signification, but I think, so, I mean, so on that also, I think science fiction films in black and white are comparatively rare, because I think the idea of science fiction is to be this kind of, quite often this really kind of dense spectacle, in which color plays a really important role. But I thought by kind of almost extracting the color from that futuristic world, it might give it a different kind of resonance or impact. So, so I guess that in terms of the aesthetics of it, maybe that stuff feeds into it. But I've got a background in dramas, so in some ways it's a continuation of that. But I know typically in my own practice, I think I have made a bit of a separation, like from when I was younger. The film documentaries were basically forms of visual political praxis. They're there just really to kind of convey ideas, communicate certain kinds of experiences, largely with a quite explicit political agenda. I'd say a lot of the documentaries throughout the years, the ones I've made, whereas the dramas, I would say the other ones I've made are a little bit more. There is a more expressionistic. You're engaging with fantasy, you're engaging with the imagination. There is a slightly less overt agenda around some of the dramas I've done, But then again, actually, some of them also, there is definitely a kind of a similar set of concerns, whether it's about identity, technology, race, power, all that stuff is also a big part of the dramas. The role of the unconscious, that's all there in the dramas. It's just basically, I just thought, well, it'd be interesting to try and take some of those themes and put them in a more of a research film context, because other documentaries I've made in the past have definitely sat into a research film university context. But this, in a way, is the first drama. I've made quite a few, but this was the first one really that I've actually produced in a university research context with a kind of underpinning research question. But I think, increasingly, even though my background's a lot around film practice, city, the creative industries, race, I am, for better or worse, increasingly interested in the role of emerging technologies. I was one of the co-conveners at a conference at Ravensbourne about the impact of emerging technologies on creative practice the year before last. And I find AI fascinating. And that's not even because I want to use AI tools as a filmmaker. I think I do a bit and will do, but it's more that its general impact and the way that people are forming these powerful emotional responses to AI. And also, I think it is a transformative technology. Not just in film practice or creative practice, but I'm more concerned possibly in terms of the role it's playing in the democratic process or the exercise of power, semi-autonomous military targeting, state surveillance, those kinds of areas is actually where I'm probably more concerned about its impact, even though I think the risk is that it will also displace creative workers. And a lot of our students are understandably super concerned about what impact AI is going to have on their employability. And they have a lot of reservations about AI tools, possibly more so than I do, and an older generation of filmmakers.
I've noticed young people have a lot of that's interesting. I have so many questions, and we only have one last minute, so we'll have to continue this conversation outside of this meeting. But I do have a final question, if that's okay with you. And I said I would. So this idea of causing creative trouble and redefining rebelliousness. Well, obviously what it is just really trying to see through the limitations of the kind of the really conservative legacy of academia, that this is the way you do things, this is the way you do research, and there is no other way, this is the right way. And obviously there's so many things which do not work for us as creative practitioners, and I think it's very helpful to see that people realize that it's actually okay to be rigorous and just break those boundaries. What do you think is the most immediate next thing that we as a community need to challenge in terms of achieving what we want? Because that's an ongoing journey.
Yeah, it's definitely an ongoing journey. And I have to say, as well as this troublemaking being an aesthetic kind of agenda or strategy, I actually do think, and this is where it really turns into a kind of troublemaking that is considered more problematic, is I actually do think it's going to be a form of political troublemaking. Or kind of broadly cultural troublemaking. And that's partly because that's my background. And I totally understand not everyone would share my political concerns. But obviously a lot of people, especially in academia, I think are hesitant about, getting reputations for being troublemakers, for being overtly involved in activism or political engagement. And I'm not saying I am all the time, but the kinds of filmmaking, the tradition of filmmaking that I'm a part of, just kind of normalized that for me. I think I was almost quite surprised when I went into more commercial sectors, and the first film I made, which was about this bodyguard who works with the Anti-Racist Alliance. He was master of the martial arts, trained psychologist. But it was only years afterwards that the TV, I made it for ITV, for Carlton Television. People came up to me afterwards and years later and saying, you wouldn't believe how scared everyone was of that film. I mean, because of my background working in the independent sector prior to that, I just thought, well, this is just kind of working for political organizations. This is fairly not harmless, but I didn't realize how much it was going to scare people. But it does, and still, spreading dissident messages or being critical or interrogating certain structures of power through creative practice is still seen as risky and challenging. If it wasn't, it probably wouldn't be worth doing it, frankly. Definitely. And that's kind of my background. I mean, I have to say, I don't think there's any real risk of me selling out, but I know that my interest in technology, for instance, and AI, in some ways, puts me on a slightly different tangent to other people who almost share my kind of political cultural background, I think. You know, so I don't know, there's always been which is not to say that I critically celebrate these technologies. I am completely aware of their risks and the ways in which they are going to be weaponized by extremely conservative and powerful interest groups in society. But for some reason, I'm still fascinated by it. Not everyone has that kind of that area of interest, but you know, I think this, even within that sphere of analysis, you can cause a lot of trouble. You can, you know, I think it's some people, that's some people's role, and I've always seen that has been my role a little bit, you know, to kind of just to do that. But it like I said, for me, it's very normalized because I was brought up in a sort of feminist commune surrounded by artists and political refugees. It just seems logical to be like that. Yeah. So I'll probably continue doing that, but you know, things do change. You kind of mellow as you get. I found I've mellowed out a bit as I've got older, but I do think collectively and as a sector, academics and film practice scholars and pretty much everyone is going to have to build resilience and build networks, because the next few years potentially are going to potentially see the consolidation of political forces that are fundamentally antagonistic to the kind of to our priorities and to our ways of seeing and our forms of creative practice and analysis. You know, I mean, depending on who wins the next election, but you know, but what's going on in the States, for me, the kind of the mainstreaming of far right ideas into government, into, you know, kind of migration policies, into even the heritage sector, and especially into higher education, mean that there's going to be a lot of challenges over the next few years. So it's good if people create networks, support systems, resources that will enable them to kind of weather the storm. Yeah. I suspect, you know.
That's a really lovely way to end, and I will probably send the email to BAFT-SIG group after our meeting today, because you've just inspired me to actually sit on it and don't delay it further. Thank you so much, Orson. It's been really, really amazing to have you here today. Fantastic presentations, really impressive body of work, and really great insights. So I really look forward to, as I said, continue this conversation, you know, beyond this meeting, and best luck with your future projects. I'm sure we're going to have lots of opportunities to talk about what's next for you. And yeah, thank you so much. I will send you the link to the recording once it's there. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and a million times thank you. Really, really great one.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Bye.
Goodbye. See ya.